HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Last Interview, a novel, by Eshkol Nevo. Translated by Sandra Silverston. Read by Josh Bloomberg. Did you always know you would be a writer? No. But at some point in my adolescence, I realized that my masturbation fantasies were much more detailed than those of my close friends. With them, it was always as bare bones as a mugshot. With me, there were obstacles, conflicts, rounded-out characters. If I wanted to be aroused by my fantasies, I had to believe them, so I constructed them in great detail. I remember a night we spent in sleeping bags in the basement of Chagai Carmeli's house. 4 close friends, and each one talked about his fantasies. I was the last one to speak, and by the time I finished, everyone was fast asleep, except Ari. Before zipping up his sleeping bag for the night, he said in a drowsy voice, "Bro, I think you're going to be a writer, but you have to learn to cut it down a little." What motivates you to write? A teacher of mine once told me to keep a journal during the Passover vacation. I took a notebook to Ras Bulka, and every once in a while I would take it up into the hills and write about the world beneath the water and the one above it. Then my parents decided to move from Jerusalem to Haifa. I wrote a few protest poems against the move, but as usual with protest poems, it didn't help. After that, in 12th grade, we had an end-of-year show, and Tali Leshem played the flute. I wanted to be around her as much as possible, in the hope that she would notice me, but I had no talent. I didn't sing or dance or play a musical instrument, so I volunteered to write the lyrics for the songs in the show. In the army, I wrote Tali letters. I thought that if she received a letter from me every day, she wouldn't leave me for someone who came home more often. In South America, after the army, I wrote letters to Dikla. Sometimes I wrote about things that happened on the trip, and sometimes I made up things that didn't happen. I noticed that I enjoyed writing the made-up things more. Dikla and I split right before I joined my first writing workshop, after I'd graduated from university, and every word that came out of me there, maybe even ever since, was an attempt to fill the huge space created by her absence. A year later, Dikla and I got back together. Then I made a few choices in my life: marriage, kids, a mortgage. Life moved on to a much too narrow path, and writing was the only thing outside it. The life I couldn't live, I wrote. It worked for a few years, numbed the longing a bit, but then Ari got sick and Shira went away to boarding school, and Dikla no longer delighted in me. That was the beginning of one of those times. A crisis, I think it's called. I figured it would be over in a few months, but I was wrong. People on the outside don't see it, but I know I'm sinking, and I know that now I write to survive. What does your workday actually look like? For the last year, I've been waging an ongoing war, a trench war in every sense, against dysthymia, an acute mood disorder characterized by a chronic, low-grade feeling of depression. In simpler terms, once I used to wake up happy, and now I wake up sad. I'm not sure I know why. I have no idea how to shake it off, and I don't know how much longer Dikla can take it. Lately, I've had the feeling that she's keeping her distance from me. Maybe she's afraid she'll catch it. Anyway, my morning always begins with strenuous physical activity, running or bike riding, which is supposed to release mood-enhancing substances into my bloodstream. Then I call Ari and we talk about Hapoel Jerusalem basketball, the nurses in the department, the chance that the Shabak Samech rappers will reunite, anything but his illness. Though the conversation is meant to cheer him up, it cheers me up too, and takes the edge off my intense feeling of loneliness. Then I doze off for a while, wake up, drink 2 cups of coffee, one after the other, eat an entire bar of milk chocolate, and turn on my computer like someone who seriously intends to write his next novel. I sit in front of the blank screen. A few minutes later, I wander over to this interview, which was sent to me by an internet site editor who collected surfers' questions for me. I answer one or two of them, 3 at the most. Now it's 1:30 already. My middle child is home from school, and the racket she makes in the living room is so distracting that there's no point in continuing. So I turn off the computer and go to make lunch. We sit down to eat together. She's been really prickly this last year, and I, with my dysthymia, find it a little hard to take. Nevertheless, I still try to get her through the tangle of thorns that has suddenly shot up around her, but that's so tiring that after lunch I have to take a nap. I set the alarm, so I won't be late to pick up my sweet little son from daycare. When he sees me come in, he laughs with joy and runs to me, and for a moment as brief as a song, it seems that everything will be fine. How autobiographical are your books? Once I knew how to answer that question. I mean, I knew that I would always respond with blatant lies to protect myself and the people close to me, but I also knew the truth, which is that there are and always were bits of autobiography in my fiction, usually in the female characters, to throw readers off the track. As time passed, things grew more complicated, because, for example, what can you do with a book that predicted what actually happened in your life? You think you've created a far-out plot, something really bizarre, then a year after the book comes out, the plot becomes reality. Is that autobiography? And what about all the behind-the-scenes stories I tell the readers at those Meet the Author evenings? Stories that are supposed to reveal the personal experiences that led me to write my books. From constant telling, those stories have become so polished and refined that I'm not sure anymore that they actually happened. Not to mention the habitual tale-telling that has slowly trickled into my personal, non-literary life. For example, when I visit Ari in the hospital. Before we went on our big trip together, my grandmother asked me, "Who are you going with?" When I said with Ari, she sighed and said, "Very good, he'll take care of you." Now his strong, sinewy arms have shriveled, and his once full cheeks are sunken. He asks me to get him a glass of water from the cooler, and when I come back, we begin to talk. Once I used to tell him what was going on with me. Today, I tell him well-constructed anecdotes. And I see in his chemotherapy eyes that he knows I'm telling him a well-constructed anecdote, and he needs me to tell him one unpolished thing, something that has no beginning, middle, or point. But I can't tell anything but stories anymore. Everything that happens in my real life, from the moment it happens, is adapted into a good story I can tell sometime. When I meet with my readers in interviews, in my hospital conversations with Ari, who closes his eyes while I'm speaking, takes my hand and says, "Let's shut up for a minute." What are you working on right now? The truth is that I'm still recovering from the previous book, or more precisely, from the endless emptiness that comes after I publish a book. That's when I invest most of my energy in trying not to fall in love. The year after publishing a book is dangerous. You walk around with such a powerful inner hunger that people can see it from the outside. And the easiest way to satisfy that hunger is to fall hopelessly in love. Let's say with a Slovakian documentary film director with a scar on her left cheek that looks like a dimple who you meet at the Haifa Film Festival. A passion that takes you a year to recover from. So it's better to stay home. Withdraw from the world, seal off your heart, to prevent any crack from forming that would allow a woman other than your wife to enter. That's what I'm working on now. As a man, how do you manage to write female characters? No one notices, but all the female characters in my books are actually variations on the same 3. My wife, the fictitious woman who is the negative image of my wife, the woman I had to give up any possibility of being with when I decided to get married, the woman who is me. I'm embarrassed to admit that it's the 3rd woman I'm most attracted to. How do you deal with the exposure involved in publishing a book? I Googled myself once. What a mistake. I spent all night reading things people wrote about me. Once during a school trip, I pretended to be asleep and heard two kids talking about me. This time, there were a lot more than two, maybe 1,000, maybe 2. On one site, they even posted a picture of the sunspots I have on my cheeks and demonstrated how to Photoshop them out. I finally went to sleep at 4 in the morning. The nasty retorts kept rising in my throat. I spooned myself against Decla's back. Once, when I did that, she would take my hand and put it on her heart. Not lately. Lately, I'm no longer sure she loves me. Nevertheless, I matched the rhythm of my breathing to hers and whispered to myself, I have a home, I have a home, I have a home. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and I suddenly began thinking about, of all people, a neighbor we'd had years ago. An elderly woman, you might even call her old, who once gave me a ride to the sea and, on the way, told me she belonged to a nudist group. And I, only 19, loved the idea and asked if I could join, to expose myself. Dawn was already visible through the shutters. My wife was still breathing the even breaths of sleep. Everything is foreseen, but there is freedom of choice. What kind of kid were you? Too much like the crying kid whose picture hung on the wall of the medical clinic. While we waited our turn to see Dr. Schneidtescher, the other kids would point alternately at him and at me. I delighted in imagining, not reading, but constantly imagining. And I fell in love, head over heels, with a different girl each time, but I never said anything to her, and I felt a persistent sense of longing. I remember myself, from an early age, always longing for what was gone. No one had died yet, but we kept moving house. I'd say goodbye to my old friends every summer, and every autumn I was supposed to find new ones. It's not clear, by the way, that that's the reason I felt a permanent sense of longing. Maybe that's just how it is. Some kids zigzag their way forward through life, and others are steeped in longing for the past. I try to isolate a concrete moment among those emotional words. That's what I ask my students to do. Be concrete. Dismantle the feeling into specific pictures. But with all the pictures, I don't know what. I was 6, maybe 7, and Grandpa Yitzchak took me to an amusement park. He was pretty old already and didn't have the strength or desire to go on the rides, so he just walked from ride to ride with me and occasionally convinced me to drink water from the army flask he'd brought with him. It was fine with me that he didn't join me on the rides. Being alone didn't frighten me then. I got on the roller coaster alone, happily, and didn't scream at all, not even on the steep descents. I found the ghost train to be mostly amusing. The Ferris wheel was an opportunity to look down at the entire city from above. Not even a shadow of fear passed through me. Until I reached the Hall of Mirrors. A seemingly innocent attraction. So innocent that I don't think it exists today. All you had to do was find the right path from the entrance to the exit, in a hall lined with mirrors. It started out fine. I took the first and second turns in the labyrinth quite confidently, but then I became trapped inside my own reflections. I remember the moment. I was surrounded by many distorted images that did and didn't look like me. Some of them had a large head and skinny legs, others the opposite, fat legs and the head of an alien. I felt slightly dizzy and had a strong feeling I'd never had before of no way out. I tried to keep walking, but wherever I turned, I encountered my distorted self, again and again. In the end, I collapsed, defeated, into a sitting position, my back against a wall, and thought, there's no point in calling for help because Grandpa doesn't hear well without his hearing aid. And I thought, I will never get out of here. Now I suddenly realize how similar that is to the nightmare Decla woke up from in terror during our first years together. She would jolt upright and pound her chest as if she were choking. Then she would look at me with wide-open eyes, not knowing who I was, and when she suddenly recognized me, she'd ask me to hug her. I didn't have to ask her what happened. I knew that she'd once again been trapped in the classroom and couldn't get out because the terrorists were guarding the door, and she tried to open the window so she could get away and couldn't do it. In life, not in nightmares, the tragedy in Ma'alot happened when her mother was pregnant with her, the 9th month. They lived right next to the school the terrorists had invaded, and when her mother heard the children's screams, she ran into her neighbor's house, where she knew they had a hunting rifle. It's amazing, I think, that two people whose worst nightmare is to be trapped between 4 walls had managed somehow to build a home together. Where do you write? For years I wanted a studio. I wanted to say things like, I'm coming from the studio. I'll call you from the studio. But it seemed to be the sort of thing that happened to other people, not to the ones who grew up in a port city and were taught not to spend a penny unless they really had to. Who needs a studio anyway, I convinced myself. Amos Oz wrote in the toilet. Nevertheless, whenever someone, a colleague, told me he was going to his studio, my heart constricted, as if it had been encircled by a tight elastic band, and involuntarily the word rolled around in my mouth. The tip of my tongue tapped lightly on the roof of my mouth with the first 2 syllables, and the third spread my lips. Studio. More than a year ago, I rented a studio, in the Moshav Givat Chen. I had no choice. I swear by everything dear to me. The building next to ours was being renovated, and the horrendous noise of the drills and hammers kept me from concentrating. Also, my eldest daughter, before she left for boarding school at Steboker, didn't really go to school, and to drown out the racket coming from outside, she played Enrique Iglesias at full volume every morning in her room. Slowly, the walls began to close in on me. A feeling of unease settled in between my stomach and chest and refused to move. I think that was when my dysthymia began, even though I still didn't know that there was such a thing as dysthymia. So I thought, I need a change of scene, and took my laptop to the office of a psychologist who worked mainly in the evening. I agreed to all the demands she said were preconditions, asking only that in the contract we change the definition from office to studio. After moving my laptop to the studio, I added a few books for atmosphere. I hung a painting I'd received as a gift from a Holocaust survivor, which Dikla said was too sad to hang in the living room, and placed Mayan's picture on the shelf. Walking distance from the studio was a grocery store that sold fresh salty bagels and olives. I like olives when I'm writing. There was an orange tree outside the studio, and the landlady said I could pick the fruit. In the studio itself, there was a coffee corner with instant coffee, Turkish coffee, and a fridge with milk in it. Everything was ready. Givat Chen, so I learned from the sign at the entrance I passed every morning, was named after the poet Chaim Nachman Bialik. No one talks about it. It's not very nice to tarnish the image of our national poet, but Bialik hardly wrote anything after immigrating to Israel. Apparently, as he once wrote, his little twig had fallen, leaving him without bud or flower, fruit or leaf. And for 10 years he produced only 9 poems, which are not among his best. Was the house they built for him in Tel Aviv too beautiful? Too comfortable? Did people's adoration rob him of the freedom every artist needs? And perhaps all his literary activities, the journals and book publishing, left him no time to stare into space. And without that, without allowing empty space to be empty, how can you replenish yourself? Or maybe it was the opposite. Maybe he took on more and more literary activities to avoid being alone with his unable-to-write self. I picture him telling his wife Manya before going to sleep that another day had passed without his having produced a poem worthy of the name, and the weary look in her eyes as she listens to him. Really, Chaim Nachman, she thinks, but doesn't say, how long can I listen to the same song? He waits, eyes open to the darkness, until she falls asleep, and then leaves the house to walk the few blocks to Ira Yan. She's a passionate woman, an artist who's still impressed by him. And after they have sex, He waits with eyes open to the darkness until Irayan falls asleep, then goes to another woman, the third. We can assume he had a third woman, to lay his bald head on her lap so she can stroke it as she sings to him in Yiddish. But all that bed-hopping in Tel Aviv is no help at all. It changes nothing, because the page waiting for him on his desk the next morning is blanker than usual. I spent long months in my studio in Givatren. I read my students' texts, I spoke on the phone, I answered emails. I went to the grocery store and came back with olives. I picked oranges and squeezed them. I stared at the picture of Maayan, the girl who was killed on Death Road and in whose backpack my book was found. I listened to entire David Bowie albums on YouTube. I read medical articles about dysthymia. I told people, I'll call you from the studio. Let's meet at my studio. I even tried to do yoga on the psychologist's yoga mat and threw out my back. Maybe it's the dysthymia that has nailed me so firmly to reality. Maybe other forces have been at work here. In the end, I decided to go back home. Go back home. The tip of my tongue waited patiently to tap lightly on the roof of my mouth as my lips alternately opened and closed around those 3 words. Do you think about your reading public when you write? Me? Are you kidding? Absolutely not. It's irrelevant, and I have no time for it. My mind is so filled with the characters' vacillations and the plot twists that there's no room for extraneous thoughts. I categorically deny. Only sometimes, like a streaker dashing onto the field in the middle of a soccer game, a powerful sense of anxiety about money bursts into my mind. What if they don't like it? What if they don't buy it? How will I make a living? For long moments, that anxiety manages to evade the guards of my self-confidence, until they finally catch up to it, grab it a bit too hard by the elbows, and escort it off the field. Do you imagine a specific reader when you're writing? For years, I imagined Dikla. I would picture myself reading the manuscript to her in bed, reading a page and dropping it to the floor, reading another page and dropping it to the floor. And she would listen and look at me with the same warm, supportive expression tinged with amusement she'd had before we kissed the first time in the apartment on Haramban Street. Recently, it hasn't been working for me, imagining Dikla as I write. I think the problem stems from the way she's been looking at me since Shira left for boarding school. Her expression's no longer warm and supportive, and it's tinged with criticism. Do you remember that I'm flying to Colombia on Sunday? I asked her last week. Yes, she said. Once, that yes held the anticipation of yearning for me. Once, her yes said, I'll miss you. This time, her yes said, it's actually a good thing you're going away for a while. To tell the truth, I've become tired of you. I'm not a child. I know that ultimately the energy between two people is destined to change its shape. It's a law of physics. I've seen it happen with other couples, and in fact, I knew that it would happen to us sometime. I just never thought it would happen to her first. A few days later, I sorrowfully packed a bag, underwear, socks, copies of my books and students' manuscripts. Usually I look forward to traveling. Usually when the plane begins to soar, so does my spirit. How do you live with the way people interpret and analyze your books? I take it in stride. Really, that's the beauty of literature. With every reading, the book is somehow rewritten, right? And that's fine with me. Besides, what can I do? Follow everyone who buys my book from the bookstore to his home, then get into bed with him and make sure he understands? Simply speaking, everyone's invited to read my books however they want to. Except for a certain academic type, usually from the literature faculty. Sometimes you can find them in the cultural criticism or gender studies departments. They're people who've been indoctrinated by the twisted promotion and tenure mechanisms of the university to focus on a very specific niche, Again and again they publish articles that examine the same research question, and they compel their students to feed on the same square meter of pasture. They've been doing it for so many years that they can read a book only through the narrow prism of their research. I was once invited to do one of those academics with theories conferences. I was happy about the invitation, I must admit. Artists need recognition, the way scientists need proof. I even snapped a picture of the poster with my name on it at the entrance to the Liberal Arts Building and sent it to my parents to make them proud. But later, at the conference itself, people with advanced degrees took the stage one after the other and imposed overly methodical readings on my book, speaking in authoritative, omniscient tones that made me feel like an ignoramus. I hunched over in the front row seat that had been reserved for me, and with every knowledgeable sentence spoken on the stage, I withdrew further and further into myself. I put my head in my hands, pressed my elbows against my chest, felt my chest stick to my stomach until I finally disappeared entirely, and the presenter apologized in my name, explaining that personal reasons had kept me from attending the conference. Can you make a living as a writer? I always fumble for an answer to that question. I explain that it's a small market, mention that I also run a workshop, point out that Dikla is the business development manager of a large firm. Sometimes I have no choice, and I also tell the well-known story of Eshkol of Ostropol, whose mother sent him to the grocery store for milk. When he left the store, he was suddenly struck by the fear that the milk was spoiled, so he took a healthy swig before continuing on his way. But then he was struck once again by the fear that the milk had spoiled during his walk, and drank again, just to make sure. And so he continued walking and stopping to take a drink until he reached home and was sent to buy milk again. As far as I know, there is no such story about Eshkol of Ostropol. It's a Yiddish tall tale that makes everyone smile in understanding when it's finished, even though the moral of the story is not exactly clear to them. That's how I dance around a simple truth. We're fine. When I left the ad agency to focus on writing, I said to Dikla, listen, we'll have to cut back. She was pregnant with our first child, Shira. Not the best time for such a conversation. Nonetheless, she immediately said, so we'll cut back. I remember every word of what we said. I remember where we were sitting, in the small kitchen of our rented apartment on Yelde Tehran Street, on folding chairs. I remember what she was wearing, a white maternity top with buttons and a ribbon that tied under her breasts, and black leggings. I even remember what was on the plate that sat on the table between us, sunflower seeds. From the beginning of that pregnancy, she had a powerful craving for sunflower seeds, and the entire house filled up with small mounds of shells. Are you sure? I asked. I'd like to remind you that you didn't marry some princess from a mansion in Savion, she replied, and that has some advantages. Besides, I'm sure your book will sell and everything will work out. And if not, we'll manage. Hello, I'm here too, you know, and that's the dream you've been talking about since we met, to write. Okay, should I run down to the kiosk and get you some more seeds? Later, she said, and pointed to the bedroom. Again? I sighed, as if I didn't want to. It's not me, she said apologetically. It's the hormones. The list of things that attracted me to Dikla is very long. Among them are some small, seemingly unimportant things, such as the smell of her shampoo or the fact that she knew by heart the plots of David Bowie music videos from the 80s. There were larger things as well, like the fact that she wasn't a flirt and didn't form opinions based on what she read in the weekend papers, and she looked away during extra-violent scenes in TV series. But I think that the hidden element, what drew me most profoundly to her, was that she didn't have a critical bone in her body. She accepted me and believed in me from the first moment, no undermining or attempts to fix me. She showed her love for me exactly the way her father showed his love for her at the family dinners in Ma'alot, with the warmth in his eyes whenever he looked at her, with the softness in his voice when he called her my little girl, with the eggplant and tahini salad he made especially for her, with the quiet but clear...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?